Fab, and I will pop up my slides. There we go. Brilliant. So, welcome back, everybody, or welcome for the first time if you didn't come along last time. I think for the people that literally have just joined, we're doing quick introductions via the chat box. So please feel free to drop in a quick message saying who you are and where you're from. That would be marvellous. I've introduced myself. I'll also introduce Richard, who said quick hi in the chat box already. Richard is helping to facilitate today, and there's a brilliant fundraiser with lots of experience in this space in his own right as well. So it's great to have Richard with us. Okay, so where are we? In our last module, we looked at the digital landscape. So we were looking at who is online, how are they online, how people are giving, and specifically we took a very initial look, because I think we're still waiting for some data really, but an initial look at how COVID was potentially affecting the digital landscape. So if you didn't come along to that, that has been recorded and is available to go off and watch on YouTube if you find it helpful to catch yourself up on that. But I suppose in terms of thinking about sort of planning and strategy for a crowdfunding campaign, really what we were doing there was looking at the external environment. And so in this session, module 2, we're going to be looking at the sort of the internal situation more generally, and thinking about how likely or how specifically that might impact on your ability to run crowdfunding campaigns. We'll look at software as well, think about the actual software that you might need. And then the final bit of this session is thinking about, again, really preparation before you actually go off and launch a campaign, but how do you go about sort of finding that crowd in the first place so that you've got a group that you can fundraise from and with and will amplify your message. So that's the plan for today. Then for our module 3 tomorrow, we're looking at the messaging specifically, really. So we're going to take a really deep dive into how you get the messaging right for a crowdfunding campaign. And then the final session really is looking at, okay, how do I know if I was successful? What can I do to potentially sort of building some testing, if that's appropriate for you? And actually, once my campaign is finished, what do I then do in terms of building ongoing relationships with people? So that's where we sit today and where this session sits within the broader programme. Okay, so for anyone who was here last week, as a very quick activity, do you want to just drop into the chat box? Is there a really sort of key takeaway or key thing that sort of stood out for you in terms of thinking about the sort of the digital environment at the moment? And if you weren't here, if there's anything that sort of leaps out to you as a key trend at the moment. So if anyone wants to sort of drop in some thoughts on that, that would be marvellous. Just going to pop up the chat so I can see what people are saying. You were very speedy, everybody. Yeah, mobile devices, says Andy. Yeah, we talked a lot about how important mobile is, both in terms of being the sort of key tool which people use to access the internet nowadays, and in terms of giving. Absolutely, more people online at the moment. Benjamin says, identifying your audience. Yeah, and I think one of the key takeaways for me from what you were sort of feeding back was, it's really about sort of understanding your audience, where they are, how they're using the internet. The difference between formal bids and crowdfunding, absolutely, yeah. The psychology of the donors and the fact that they like something back. I mean, that again, we'll mention that again today, but it's very common in the world of crowdfunding that you get some sort of benefit for it. And yes, the speed, absolutely. Older people using social media, yeah, and digital tools generally. We talked quite a bit about the fact that the key thing that always sticks in my mind is actually that the baby boom generation are online for 2 hours more a week than 16 to 34s, which is a really interesting statistic. Speed, yes. So absolutely, all really good points there. I suppose I kind of listed, for anyone who wasn't here last week, the really key points, I think, many of which you've mentioned already, but the majority of people are online, but including that older audience, absolutely, as you made clear. The fact that people are increasingly online during COVID. So again, they're using more tools, spending more time online. And I'll go, okay, we need to see the data on this, but quite a lot of people said actually they think they'll continue that digital usage after the end of COVID. We talked in terms of a growth in online giving generally, and again, early days in terms of statistics, but how that has potentially been heightened by the COVID situation. And there was a little bit of a mixed picture in terms of giving and money, again, very specifically in terms of COVID, with more people saying that they would donate more than the number of people saying they would donate less. But potentially a shift in the sort of types of causes that people were giving to. So there's been a big jump, for example, and this won't surprise anyone, I'm sure, in the percentages of people saying they're going to give to or have given to hospitals and hospices, which is not to say, again, that campaigns in the archive sector won't be successful. There's definitely been some good examples of those, but I think really important to be aware of these overarching trends. So like I said, if you want to sort of dive into that and you weren't here last week, please feel free to go off and watch the recordings. But let's jump into to this week. And again, as I said, we talked last week about the external environment. So thinking about developing our plan moving forwards, it's really important to understand the internal environment, and that's what we'll talk about initially. Again, I showed you this slide last week, but I just thought, again, I'd just bring it back, again, just in case anyone has come along for the first time this week and is just wondering what is crowdfunding. It's a slightly sort of facetious definition here, isn't it? Crowd, a bunch of people funding, providing money. So crowdfunding is a bunch of people giving money. But I think that does bring out some important elements around, particularly around, as someone mentioned in the chat, actually, it's not one big funder that you're going off to and waiting a few months to hear back. It is about lots of people giving, I suppose, relatively small amounts of money, commonly, to a specific time-limited project. So that's just to set that context if you weren't here for that session. And I think often when we talk about crowdfunding, people think that that's a relatively recent innovation. And I think it's fascinating to look back at the history of fundraising generally. And I thought you as archivists would appreciate this, but to see how crowdfunding as an idea has actually been around for a really long time. So a really nice example actually is the campaign to build the base of Statue of Liberty in New York. So as I'm sure you know, the French gifted the statue itself. But neither the government nor any specific wealthy philanthropists actually wanted to pay for the base that the statue was going to sit on. So Joseph Pulitzer, in his newspaper, the New York World, actually created a crowdfunding campaign. So he said that he would publish the name of anyone who donated, no matter how small a gift, and that if you donated $1, you were going to get a 6-inch replica of the statue. If you donated $5, you'd get a 12-inch replica of the statue. And by autumn 1885, 120,000 people had actually given to this campaign. And that raised $100,000, which in today's money is about $2.3 million. So as you can see, this idea of lots of people giving small amounts of money, and in this particular case as well, getting some sort of reward for that, is not a completely new idea by any stretch of the imagination. But it's, I suppose, in our technologically enabled world, it's given that sort of a campaign a really sort of new impetus. So, okay, sorry, just to get my clicker back. So if we're thinking about the plan, we need to understand the external and internal situation. So as we said, last week was really about understanding the external world. We'll do some work this week on that internal piece. But then it's really important to have in place a goal, so you know exactly how much it is that you need to raise. You want to have in place donation and reward tiers. So like Pulitzer, $1 buys you a 6-inch statue, $5 buys you a 12-inch statue. You want to have those worked out in advance for your campaign. Crucially, And I suppose it looks very obvious on the page, but I think is sometimes where crowdfunding campaigns actually fall down. You want to have an audience in place in advance. So, you know, we can't just sort of create these ideas, pop them on a platform and expect them to almost sort of naturally go viral. We need to have built our crowd beforehand so they can potentially spread it to their contacts and, of course, donate to it themselves. We need to have a well-developed case. So that's really what we're going to focus on in the next session. So I won't dwell on what that needs to include, but we'll look very specifically at what makes a good case next time. You want to think about publicity. So linked to that point about an audience, you know, it's not a case of just stick it on a platform and expect people to come to you. You still, like any sort of fundraising activity, you've got to get out there and make people aware of what it is that you're doing. And finally, as we'll talk about in the last session, you want to have a plan in place to build ongoing relationships. Again, it could just be a one and done, people give to you and you know, and that's it. But it just seems like you'd be missing a huge opportunity to grow your supporters for the long term if you weren't seeking to build on those relationships that you've developed through this particular campaign. So as I said, last week we looked at external. This week we're going to focus in on that internal situation. So this is the tool, I think, for any sort of fundraising planning or strategy that I like to utilise in order to give a sort of good broad look at what's happening internally. So this 5Ms tool for me encourages you to take this sort of broad, holistic look at what's happening within your organisation. So your first M, as you can see, sort of crossed out, replaced with people, is men. So anything, you know, people related, really. So you could be thinking about, you know, do you have enough staff in the organisation with the right skills? Do you have senior management support? You know, if you have a board of trustees or similar, are they on board and engaged? So anything related to people issues. Volunteers, again, you know, have you got volunteers that'll get involved in this and potentially share it with their networks? Anything people related at all. Money is a fairly sort of obvious one. So that's thinking around budgets. You know, do you have an expenditure budget? Is it a sufficient expenditure budget to run this? Machines. So that would encompass things like, most obviously, I suppose, things like your fundraising database. Again, if you have one, or some means of keeping track of donors, of donations. It would potentially encompass your website as a key tool here. Also, and we'll come back to this in a little bit more detail, it would encompass the particular crowdfunding platform that you're going to utilise. Do you have all of those things? So anything equipment related that you might need here. Mission. Again, we'll link to that case for support. So in a way, I wouldn't worry too much about this at this exact point in the course, because we're going to come back and look at that as a sort of separate piece. But you know, are you clear about what it is that you want to achieve through this campaign? Minutes is obviously where they were struggling a bit for an M to sort of encompass this idea, but it's processes. So, you know, do you have the right processes in place, for example, to claim things like gift aid, to be able to say thank you to people that have supported you, all of those sort of background processes and procedures that you might want to put in place in order for this to be successful. So at this point, what I thought we could do is take a quick break into some breakout groups to give you a chance to chat with a couple of other people about any of these sort of 5M issues that jump out at you. So we've only got sort of 10 minutes or so it's not going to be absolutely comprehensive, but it would be good to share, if there's anything particular, if there's any one or two of those M's that for you think immediately, gosh, this is going to be a bit of a problem. We don't have anyone internally, for example, with digital knowledge or skills, you know, whatever it might be. Anything that you want to sort of flag up between you from those 5Ms. So I'm going to pop us out into some breakout rooms. So we've got that. Brilliant. So if everyone, if you're typing away, I just thought Christopher raised a really good point in our group that I was going to mention back to everyone around, I suppose particularly around the people point, and about some of the skills, etc., that you might need to access might be sitting sort of elsewhere within your organisation. I guess particularly people that are part of much bigger organisations like universities, for example, and how it's a bit of a challenge at the moment, isn't it, to sort of build some of those internal relationships, because you're not having those sort of water cooler moments where you just bump into people and say hi and build those relationships naturally. We're having to sort of schedule these sort of chats in with people, which is an interesting time. So breakout, Andy, what sort of budget do you need? We'll touch on it, because I think it's going to be dependent really on sort of the size of your existing crowd and those sorts of things. Similar point for Victoria about concerned about the investment needed. Yeah, time and money to make the campaign effective. And the next question of incentives, absolutely. But I think it's really good to think about that stuff now, rather than again, put something on a website and for it to come to nothing or be a bit of a damp squib, because again, the assumption amongst some people has been that you just put it out there and magic happens and people give money. So I think it's actually, if you come out of this thinking actually crowdfunding is not for us at this moment, I actually think that's a really good takeaway. She says on a crowdfunding course, but I think sometimes if you decide not to do something because you realize it's not quite right, I think that's really good. A takeaway was to get creative with incentives and rewards. Absolutely, I think we mentioned a few of those on the last session as well, didn't we? Someone was talking about just afternoon tea with a creator, for example, when you might be able to when we can actually get together and actually have things like afternoon tea. But yeah, things like visits and tours, things that don't draw heavily on your resources. Yeah, I think definitely thinking about and we'll talk about it as well in terms of building your crowd. You're thinking about the assets you already have and how you can use those cleverly, I think is a really good point. Christopher, local authority archives, make it clear that people, yes, aren't being asked to pay something that the tax already funds. Absolutely. And I think when we meet again and talk about making the case, I think that's a really important element to bring in there. Absolutely. Fab. So like I said, that's a very sort of quick taster of a tool that I think is a really helpful tool to encourage you to take that that sort of broader look internally. Oh, sorry, Helen's just added another point as well. Yeah, physical visits might be an option at a later stage. Absolutely. I guess there might be some interesting things you could still do on Zoom though. I did. It's amazing what you can do, isn't it? I did Zoom wine tasting actually the other day, which was you never would have thought of that. But actually, I was like, that was a better experience to do on Zoom than it would have been in real life, if there's such a thing. Because I was like, oh, you just drink your wine and then just collapse on the sofa and not have to worry about driving places. And so there might be a way of again using those assets in this sort of virtual space as well. But really important point. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to jump us back into the slides and leap on. So, again, yes, when you have a little bit more time and you're actually thinking about preparing a plan, I think a tool like this that encourages you to look broadly at what's going on internally is a really important one. Okay. So, again, thinking about internally, getting prepared, all of those sorts of good points. Once you've sort of assessed the general internal situation, I think it's then starting to think about the type of campaign you're going to run and the type of tools that you're going to use. One thing to consider in that broad sense is what type of crowdfunding campaign you're running. Probably the first two are less common or less applicable in our world, but I'll mention them just in case it does sort of stimulate any ideas for you. So you do see equity crowdfunding. So that's really kind of investment crowdfunding. And crowdfunding as a model is used in the private sector as well as obviously in our sector. So this is the idea that you would be making a donation in return for a share of the business. You've got lending-based crowdfunding, which again sort of does what it says on the tin, really. The idea that you're making a loan to an organisation in return for a specific interest rate. But the last two are much more sort of commonly used in our world. So there's reward-based crowdfunding. which again we've mentioned, haven't we? The idea that, you know, I'm giving a donation at a certain level and I'll get something back, whether that's, you know, as we said, a visit or a chat with a curator or a booklet or, you know, some sort of reward. And donation-based crowdfunding, again, pretty obviously is where people are giving and there's no expectation of any reward there. So like I said, you know, does that stimulate any sort of new or slightly different ideas or different ways that you could run your campaign? You also, obviously, under this sort of heading of machines in the internal section, need to think about what sort of platform you're going to run your campaign on. So things to consider. The crowdfunding model, so again, you know, back to what we were just talking about, there are, you know, different platforms depending on the type of crowdfunding you're using. It's also worth just considering whether the platforms you're looking at are based on a all or nothing versus keep it all model. So some people, you only get the money where you hit your target, otherwise it's you know, given back for the donors, whereas others, you know, you keep it regardless of whether or not you hit the target. A type of project is related to, again, some of the crowdfunding platforms are specifically set up with, you know, particular sort of specialisms in mind. So, for example, there's a platform that deals particularly with legal fees, which is probably, you know, not so much for our world. But there is one, again, for example, that helps to publish books. So it might be, I mean, I thought that might be something that, you know, an archive might be considering. So again, it might be worth looking at, is there a platform that's, you know, specialist in the type of project that you're trying to deliver? You can also think about, you know, support available. So will the platform actually, you know, help you in terms of developing and promoting the campaign? Do you need that extra bit of hand-holding? And of course, the one that I think we're all pretty conscious of is, you know, what sort of fees will you have to pay, or what sort of fees will be taken by the platform? And this slide is really a one to sort of take away, just to sort of compare and contrast, looking at sort of key elements. So, you know, the platform fees, the payment fees, where it's based, and whether or not there's sort of extra funding available. I say bear in mind that one of the featured platforms is Crowdfunder, and the the actual comparison table was put together by Crowdfunder, so, you know, might not be completely independent, but it will give you a little bit of a taste of some of the platforms that are out there commonly used in our space and some of the comparative fees. Just be aware that, you know, it's interesting that Crowdfunder looks like the best on this one, doesn't it? So, like I said, really a sort of takeaway for you to have a look at. Okay. So that's the sort of the broader internal situation. The second part really that we were going to think about was building your crowd. So I'm thinking particularly here, almost, you know, in advance of potentially launching the campaign, how do you sort of go about bringing together that crowd that you can launch your campaign to? So again, this is a quick sort of type in the box suggestion. And I won't kind of read all of these out necessarily, but I think, you know, it'd be useful for you to sort of read back through the thread and see what other people are suggesting. If you want to drop in the box, you know, where are your sort of current audiences who are, you know, interested in what your archive does? So, you know, are there particular websites that they would use? Are there, you know, particular social media channels or particular groups within those social media channels? So Facebook groups, are there still, you know, people out there still sort of using Yahoo or Google groups who have a really particular interest? If anyone would like to sort of just jot in the chat box where your, you know, audiences might be. And I thought, again, like I said, this might be a good chance to sort of share a few ideas here. Yeah, existing Facebook followers. Yeah, yes, and Kat has mentioned, haven't said I'm not going to read them, I'll read some. Friends and members of the largest organisation. Actually, yeah, you might have you know, email lists and all those sorts of things already of people that you can sort of engage with digitally. I'm thinking about where their sort of offline engagement sort of translates into the online world as well. So I'll let you just keep typing away if anyone's got any thoughts to add in there. I could just give you a minute or so and then I'll leap on. Mm. Helen says, just to mention this one, it's quite an interesting, academics and specialists. We'll talk a little bit later on about influencer marketing. And absolutely, these people might be sort of key influencers in your field. So they might be, obviously, as members of the community, they're really valuable, but also as potential people that are going to go and influence other people more than, however you define it, the sort of the normal supporter. Absolutely. Andy asks about buying lists. I mean, I think that's sort of increasingly tricky in a post-GDPR world, Andy, to access useful data there. But again, if anyone's got any suggestions you want to sort of add in to reply to Andy, particularly in the sort of the online world where people have had to, very explicitly opt into marketing, it's not very easy to do that in our sort of new world. Fab. Okay. If anyone, again, if you have any further ideas, please feel free to keep dropping them in the box. But I will jump on and just give you a few sort of different ways of, starting to build that crowd, encouraging people to engage with you. So Google and how you sort of get to the top of Google search engines. I mean, again, that could be an entire session in its own right, really, I think. But this was one of the key topics I looked at as part of my sort of digital diploma. And the thing that really sort of jumped out to me here was that you can spend a lot of time trying to keep up with exactly how Google, who Google's algorithm works to push content up. But the overarching point really is that Google wants to provide a really good service to its users. Its advertising revenue comes from being, the very best search engine that's out there. That's what it wants to do and to be. So actually, if we really, really focus on creating really good quality content that's going to add value to your audience, ultimately that's really what the Google algorithm is trying to deliver. So, it probably doesn't hurt to have a quick look at some of the key things that you can do to push yourself up the list. We talked last time, I think, about the importance of being accessible to mobiles, for example. But that real focus on actually good quality content rather than trying to sort of game the algorithm, stuffing your page with certain words and those sorts of things, actually will organically, I think, help to sort of push you up the Google rankings. But again, for anyone who's interested, there's lots and lots of stuff out there about or people's assumptions about how the Google algorithm works that you can look up. But bear in mind that quality content for the user, and that's really what will help to push you up to the top of rankings. So talking about quality content, I'm going to give you another chance to sort of break out and have a chat about some ideas here. So one of the key things you can do in this space is what they call sort of content marketing, and really that's linked to the point we were talking about when we talked about coming up with potential incentives for people. Thinking about, what assets have I already got and how can I use them effectively to, create content for my website to ergo boost me up the rankings. So for ease, I think I'm just going to send everyone off into the same breakout rooms if that's all right. So I'm going to pop you off into a breakout room. Brilliant. Fab. So sorry, a bit of a quick a quick chat there, but again, I think it's one of those exercises. It's worth sort of sitting down already and thinking about what have we already got that we could sort of put out and share with people. Again, I won't do sort of formal feedback from that just to keep us on time, but if people want to share ideas again via the chat, ideas that came out of your discussions, please feel free to pop them into the chat so you can give everyone else some ideas there. So I'll whip us through a couple of other ideas. So as well as obviously, using our content and trying to drive people to our website organically, we can potentially pay using Google AdWords. And again, looking into the algorithm that sits behind advertising, again, it's very similar theory, I would say, in that, as it says on the slide, Google really wants to provide a brilliant experience to anyone that clicks on ads. So again, it's worth thinking about. It's not just about the amount of money that you're prepared to pay for the advert. It's also about the quality experience of the user when they get there. So again, if you were to do something like, I don't know, stick free all over something, or use something that you think will pull people in, but then what you're offering at the other end doesn't align with it, then Google will automatically sort of push you down its rankings. It wants people to continue to click on its advertising, so it cares about quality. And again, I've popped the link on the bottom here to say that certain organisations are eligible for some free advertising. So if you're not aware of that, do go and check that out, because that can be a really useful resource. Social media, again, is another way to get people to engage with you and potentially to go into your website. Again, it could be an entire session, couldn't it, really? But a few sort of key tips around thinking about, as we started to already, where are my users already, and what sort of sites are my users using, and making sure we're on the right platforms. Being really clear about who you are and the voice that you use in that social media space. But using that as a channel to share some of the great content that, again, we sort of started to refer to already. Talking to people, connecting to influencers, as we've mentioned, who can sort of amplify your message. Joining in conversations with hashtags, I guess most people will be aware of, but you can sort of jump into existing conversations or potentially even start new conversations about key topics using hashtags, and really sort of engaging with the audience. And there's a really fantastic case study. Anyone who's sort of in this space on social media, you could do far worse than to check out the Museum of English Rural Life on Twitter. And this particular tweet around, look at this absolute unit, was amazingly successful for the Museum of English Rural Life. As you can see, by the stats on the right-hand side, it did that dreaded word. It went viral. And Richard's going to pop into the discussion box for you a link where you can sort of look at the full details of that case study, because we haven't really got time to go into it in huge detail. But again, that key thing to say is, it doesn't just, well, not very often, it doesn't just happen. Things going viral. They put a lot of work into, again, the background within the organisation. So, for example, the archivist within the organisation was, working through the sources and digitising them and being really clear about what could and couldn't be used in the social media space. They've built relationships already. So, there's a lot to learn, I think, from their approach. But sadly, the point about, you can't just put a great piece of content out there and expect it to go viral. There's a lot of background work that this organisation had done for this particular post to be quite as successful as it was. But a really interesting organisation to check out, and they use their archive brilliantly, I think, to generate conversation and inspiration via Twitter. So, as I said, have a look at the full case study for details on that. Okay, in terms of other things around sort of building the crowd, we've mentioned influencers, haven't we, already? And all these sort of stats on the left-hand side of the slide are really, again, pointing to this key idea that increasingly, we've got less trust in advertising paid for in corporations. We want to hear from people that we know and that we trust. And when I say influencer, I think, often people's minds turn to people like, Kim Kardashian and those sorts of people. And again, they're not necessarily the people that are going to engage with our archives. So one of the terms they use in influencer marketing is this idea of micro-influencers, of looking for people who have, particular expertise in a sort of narrower field, maybe have 1,000 followers up. So, not the millions that, people like the Kardashians would have. But trying to identify, and again, as someone has already mentioned in the comments section, who is out there with sort of expertise in your field that people know and respect, and trying to identify those particular people that could amplify your message. They'll be incredibly helpful for you, both in terms of building your audience generally, but specifically also being able to advertise and promote your crowdfunding campaign. which links into this slide really, which again, you know, as you start to build your crowd, being quite smart about it. So thinking about, they call it interest and power on this particular diagram, but okay, so who are those people who have, you know, high levels of interest in you and you really want to keep them informed, but people who have these sort of high levels of, in inverted commas, power, potentially these people, as we said, who are the influencers, who've got that level of expertise and people respect, you might want to build that relationship to be even closer with those people, to really sort of look after them, make sure that they have a good relationship with you, that they get information in advance, that, you know, you're helping them to look sort of smart and knowledgeable to their supporters as well. So thinking about, you know, who are those really sort of key people once you've started to build your crowd that you need to build those closer relationships with. Having mentioned sort of social media organic, again, you know, social media, you can pay for advertising there to try and sort of, again, build your list of supporters. And there's some good tips again for you on that left-hand side about, again, being really clear about, you know, what it is you're trying to achieve with any advertising. Thinking again about the audience that you're trying to reach out to. And a good tip, I think, is that, you know, if you've already started to share things in this sort of more organic way, what's worked really, really well for you in that organic space that you could potentially put some money behind and actually make it into sort of paid advertising. Linked to the point about objectives, being really clear about what matters. You know, do you want people just to see your advert out there, or are you wanting to get people who actually are clicking on something, engaging with you, signing up to mailing lists, whatever it might be. As we've already mentioned, the importance of mobile, making sure these things work in the mobile space. And we'll talk about sort of testing and measuring results when we come back together, so I won't dwell on those. But again, I think those rules would apply to regardless of which particular social media channel you might be using, because most of them offer paid advertising, and the principles would apply across all. Where should you put your money if you are going to spend on advertising? And we referred to this source last week, and I think it's a useful source, and it shows you, you know, which channels have the highest return. As you can see, search blows everything else out of the water, really, and that's because I suppose you're reaching people right at the time at which they're interested in something. You know, if they're trying to find their local archive and then you sort of pop up with a paid ad, you're there right at the sort of the perfect moment. But at the same time, I think it's worth being aware of the subtleties here, in that would those people have clicked on your ad, would clicked on your website anyway, organically, because you've done that work to make sure you're at the top of the list. So although search looks brilliant on the page, you know, are you essentially in some cases paying for people that would have come to you in a organic way? Okay, so you've got people interested, using all these different ways of seeking to build your base. Once you've kind of got them, you really need to, I suppose, capture their data ideally so that you can work with them. So it's really helpful on your website to have just maybe a simple form that you can use to capture at the most basic level, name and email. And we know, I suppose, the other thing to consider is we know that it's great to have lots more data on who supports us, you know, how old they are, where they're from, lots of, you know, useful data that can help us to get an understanding of our audience. But every time we add another piece of data or another requirement to type something in a box, that decreases the amount of people that will ultimately sign up. So I think when you're thinking about actually sort of capturing the data to build your crowd, just thinking quite carefully about what other bits of data you need, and not just sort of chucking lots of requests at them, because that will ultimately reduce the proportion of people that actually sign up. We absolutely, in the sort of the post-GDPR and actually in our world, the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, PECA, we absolutely have to make sure that wherever we're capturing and storing data, that's done in a compliant way. So, you know, do make sure that is the case. And similarly, as well as, you know, the basic sort of form on the website, you can think about other ways in which you can encourage people to sign up. So it could be that, you know, everybody in the organisation has an email footer for a certain period of time, encouraging people to add themselves to your emailing list, etc., etc. So seeing all these other sort of potential opportunities to capture data and bring people into your crowd. And as we said, as we move into in our next sessions, the more specific crowdfunding information, thinking about kind of building the building the actual program. These are the key people who'll be able to sort of give to us, but potentially also spread our message to other people. So that brings us to the end of today's session. I'm going to just jump out of the slides and see if there's anything key in the chat box. I think people are just a couple of people having to disappear off. So thank you very much for coming along today. As we said, I'm sort of formally at the end of the session, but if people want to ask any questions or throw in any further thoughts, I'm very happy to sit and address any of those. But otherwise, hopefully see some people tomorrow for the session on building the case, which is going to be taking a really deep dive into looking at some really successful and potentially some unsuccessful examples as well.